Welcome everyone to the fourth webinar in this series of global webinars. And as you know by now, many of you have been following for the last 3 weeks. The aim really is to try to sort of look at some big global questions, but also get global perspectives on those questions as well, and try to draw on the scholarship and expertise from around the world as much as one can in a particular webinar format. And I'm glad to say that today we've got 3 fantastic speakers lined up for you as well to discuss the kind of international system of power. So, as you know, we looked at the liberal international order in the kind of broadest sense from 3 perspectives about 3 weeks ago. And 2 weeks ago, we looked at the United Nations, and particularly with a focus on disarmament politics, but also the Israel-Palestine Arab-Israeli question. And then last week, we had a very another interesting discussion on kind of Brazilian, British, and Indian perspectives on Brexit, Modi, Trump, and Bolsonaro, and the whole kind of right-wing populist upsurge which they represented. And this week we've got a really interesting discussion lined up on another aspects of the development aspects of the international system of power in regard to the OECD, the World Bank, IMF, and so on, but also the ways in which South-South cooperation has been occurring and what the prospects for that might be. So with that, I'm going to, in a moment, hand over to Juvaria to introduce the theme and the speakers. But I just want to say that we have been supported by several bodies in this series, in particular, obviously, the Department of International Politics at Citi, but also LSE Ideas, INEU in Brazil, which is a Brazilian Society for the Study of US Politics, History, and Political Economy, the Miami Institute for the Study of the Social Sciences, the University of West London. And I'm very pleased to say also that 3 new partners have signed up to support us at Kassel University's Global Partnership Network, the Center for Hemispheric and American Studies at the University of Havana, and the Wire news website in New Delhi. So really pleased that the network is expanding and we're reaching hopefully many more people in other parts of the world as well. And so with that, I'll hand over to Juvaria to please to introduce the theme and our speakers today.
Thanks, Inderjeet. I've been looking particularly forward to this session. It ties in very closely to our broader theme of global knowledge. Today's talks will be centered on international institutions and the ideas that they disseminate. It's quite widely understood now how international institutions exert power through their policies, but the authoritarian and hierarchical nature of knowledge production has only recently come under more scrutiny, particularly as it applies to concepts like development and governance. We'll be discussing this over the next hour or so with our speakers. Before that, let me introduce who we have with us today. So first of all, we have Professor Diane Stone, who is a professor at the School of Transnational Governance. Previously, she was Dean of the School of Public Policy at the Central European University in Budapest and Vienna. Professor Stone has worked at the World Bank at Washington, D.C., and then for 10 years until 2012, she was a member of the Council of the Overseas Development Institute, a London-based think tank. Her research interests include the influence of ideas and expertise on policy, the political economy of higher education, the new diplomacy, the study of policy networks, international philanthropy, policy transfer and translation, and think tanks and policy advice. The title of her talk today is Global Knowledge, Global Power, and the International System of Power. Our second speaker is Flavia de Campos Mello, who is a professor of international relations at PUC Sao Paulo in Brazil. She's also a member of INEU, which is Brazil's National Institute for Studies on the United States. Her research interests focus on global governance issues, multilateralism, Brazilian foreign policy, and international political economy. And our third speaker today is Professor Omar Dahi. He is an associate professor of economics at Hampshire College and a research associate at the Political Economy Research Institute at UMass Amherst. His research institutes are in economic development, international trade, domestic and international political economy, South-South economic and political relations and comparative regionalism, as well as post-conflict recovery and critical security studies. The title of his talk today will be The Uncertain Promise of South-South Relations. Thank you all for joining us today.
Hey, Diane, it's all yours.
Okay, I'll just share my screen. Share. And I hope that you now see it. Thank you very much for the invitation today. Since being invited and giving the title to the organizers, I've changed the title, as I usually do, once I start thinking about the topic. So what I'm going to talk about today is still very much on the original theme of the title, but I've summarized it to talk about global policy networks as an architecture that is emerging and growing more apparent in the international system of power. And I'm going to look at this through the lens of some public policy concepts to talk about policy networks and the way in which policy networks incorporate knowledge and expertise, science, and different ways of modeling realities in order to inform global governance. And I think it's a truism today to say in all areas of policy that expertise is called upon and drawn in as a form of evidence into the development of public policies, whether that's at a local level or at a transnational level. So what I'll be talking about when I go through the different types of networks is that all networks call upon knowledge and expertise in some way, as well as professional experience and other kinds of sources of power, whether that's material resources, political power, or other forms of power, in order to give effect to the operations of policy networks. And you will also see there that I use the phrase the transnational ecology of power rather than the international system of power. And I use this phrase, the transnational ecology, in order to give a sense of the densely networked character of global governance, but also transnational to reflect the ways in which civil society actors and private sector actors are also increasingly involved in governance and network arrangements. Now I'm going to talk about 4 different types of network species. These are ideal types. I'm simplifying here. There are many other kinds of networks, but I just want to focus on these 4 types for today's presentation. And these are networks that are directly involved in some fashion in policy making, policy implementation, and policy delivery. I will go through each of these in order and end with knowledge networks, since it's the focus of today's discussion. Now, why do I focus on these kinds of networks? My argument I'll put up front. My view is that these kinds of networks are growing dramatically in number. They're easier to form than, let's say, a new organization like an international organization. They're easy to unpack and to form into new kinds of networks. International organizations, as well as governments, have been conveners or gestators of many different kinds of policy networks and act as patrons, donors, and funders of many different types of policy networks. They have extensive policy ambit into all areas of governance. Some are increasingly making public decisions despite their semi-private or semi-public status. So I think there's some very big transparency and accountability questions in relation to global policy networks, at the same time as there is a very high degree of public ignorance or lack of knowledge about the global policy network architecture that is emerging. So again, there are questions about this being potentially an elite form of governance. So I'll move on to the first type of network, Global public policy networks was one of the original terms that was used for this first type. Multi-stakeholder initiatives. This is a favorite term of UN agencies. Or transnational public-private partnerships. They're all pretty much the same kind of thing, despite the different labels. What is the key feature of this particular species of network is that they're partnerships between government and international organization on the one hand, with the private sector or corporate sector actors on the other hand, as well as other relevant stakeholders, whether that's from civil society or from a specific scientific field. The relevant actors from those three sectors, tripartite, become involved in an issue-specific global public policy network. Now, I'll give you some examples. The best known example is Gavi, the Gavi Alliance, which is about the delivery of vaccines. Have difficulty affording vaccines. It was initially, to come to the tripartite structure of it, it was initiated and bankrolled by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but had the involvement also of a number of international organizations and developing country governments. And then big pharmaceutical companies were also involved. So there you have the three-way partnership, bringing together resources to fund this kind of highly institutionalized policy network. There are some other examples up there on the screen. The Global Road Safety Facility is another transnational public-private partnership, which has been gestated by the World Bank, and again, some other examples there. But the key thing is this public, private, and often civil society partnership between players. Sometimes it's been described as a neo-corporatist arrangement. There have been criticisms of some of these partnerships that it partially privatizes public decision-making by incorporating private players in these networks. But there are also other factors that have been brought to attention of how these kinds of partnerships also are effective in combining resources, preventing duplication for the delivery of global public goods. So that's one type of network. The second type of network is a transgovernmental network. It's different from the previous type in the sense that it is purely public. Okay, the participants involved in it are officers of the state. They're public officials. So this kind of network is intergovernmental. It's a way for the state to unpack and unfurl itself through networks of its public officers and bureaucrats and civil servants cooperating with their counterparts in other countries. So networks of judges, legislators, and regulators. Some examples here, and this is an area where the OECD is quite well involved in the sense of helping create or gestate these kinds of networks. So tax inspectors without borders, not an original name there, but it gives you an idea of the way in which tax inspectors from many different countries cooperate with each other. Tax inspectors are public servants. They're employed by the state. So the only kind of participants in these kind of networks are state actors. One of the key writers in this field is Anne-Marie Slaughter, who used to be Dean at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University. She's now in a think tank, but she was also a high-level official in the State Department in the US. The G20 can also be described as a transgovernmental network, because it's also an informal international organization. It doesn't have a treaty basis. Okay, so it's more of a club as well. But more generally, these types of networks are at a lower level of operation, working in a specific field of activity, whether money laundering would be another example, where government officials cooperate with each other across borders. So the sources of transgovernmental network power here is that rests on the state. They're elected officials or appointed officials, public servants. So a transgovernmental network is a manifestation of state sovereignty and a way in which states are able to respond to the nature of cross-border problems and to cooperate to deal with those cross-border problems. Okay, the third type of network, and this is the one that I think many people are quite familiar with. It's a transnational advocacy network. And like the name says, it's about the advocacy of norms and values in a particular area. Such networks often have a social movement character or issue focused on the protection of a particular species or the advocacy of the rights of a certain group of people or a community, such as an advocacy network on child soldiers or an advocacy network on blood diamonds or dirty diamonds, for example. So promoting a cause. So a little bit like an advocacy group, an interest group that's promoting certain values and norms and is promotional. Here, again, a few examples in just one area. There are a lot of gender-based transnational advocacy networks, but there are also a lot of environmental networks as well, that can, as I said, be species based, or for the preservation of forests within a certain region of the world. So just about any area of policy you can think of, you are likely to find an advocacy network. But when it comes to their sources of power, these transnational advocacy networks are probably weaker in the sense of their power and public authority. They're often more based within civil society. They're about advocacy in a gender setting. They're outsiders somewhat more to the policy processes of international organizations, governments, and various kinds of summits that might be going on. So the sources of their power are the numbers and the support that they're able to garner, and the strength of their arguments, their persuasiveness, their social media campaigns, and the voice that they give to particular causes. So as I say, more like outsiders to the policy process, certainly when compared with transgovernmental networks that I previously described. And the fourth kind, knowledge networks. Knowledge networks fitting a bit more into the topic of today's session. And knowledge networks are networks where there is a shared knowledge exchange, but often towards informing policy. So they're both science-based and policy-oriented as well, creating and transferring knowledge through an invisible college, through scholarly collaborations, scientific exchanges, the kinds of information, ideas, models, templates that are being built up within scholarly and professional communities. Now, I'm drawing out for heuristic purposes this idea of knowledge networks, and yes, they do exist in reality as well, and I'll come to an example or two in a moment. But knowledge, of course, knowledge, expertise, flows through the other types of network structures that I've already mentioned. It's just that the character can change somewhat depending on the mission and the orientation of the particular network that you're talking about. So some examples. Just a bit more description. Knowledge networks composed of various kinds of scientists or scholars, consultants, think tankers, but essentially about the input of expertise into policy making and global or transnational governance. And I think we can see today the way in which knowledge creation has been transnationalized as a consequence of advances in telecommunications and the ease with which we can now share information. Examples. One of my favorites, the Global Development Network, which was founded and created by the World Bank. This is a network of think tanks and development research institutes, not just through developing and transition countries, but also with some partners in OECD countries as well. This is now about 20 years old and quite well established. So as a network, as it originally established, it has institutionalized and formalized itself into an international organizations. I like this example because it's good at showing how networks are organic things. Okay, they can change shape over time. So this is one example that has institutionalized into an organization, but other kinds of networks wither and die or can become merged with another network. A few more other knowledge networks that are in operation. Just to give you a sense of the diversity of networks, knowledge networks that are around. And then now to go on to their roles, which I've already touched upon, I would say. Capacity building, providing knowledge resources to help build capacity in developing countries, which is certainly the objective of the Global Development Network. Some critics would argue it's also about dispensing a Western orientation of development and also a neoliberal view of economics as well. One of the criticisms leveled at the Global Development Network. But more generally, the role of NETs, about delivery of the global public good of information. Some networks perform a science diplomacy role, maybe in questions we can go into those. I haven't got time to go into science diplomacy in detail today, but very important roles in terms of agenda setting, providing intellectual credibility and scholarly justifications for the course of policy that an international organization or a group of organizations or governments might want to take. So when it comes to net power, knowledge network power, and it's not just networks, it can be single centers of knowledge creation, have a source of perhaps a longer term power, maybe not immediate power, not next week or next month, but longer term power in providing cause and effect scientific explanations for why policy problems have come about. A cause and effect explanation as to why there might be climate change, why the populations of certain species of tuna might be declining in the oceans. And providing the cause and effect explanation can then lead to specific policy recommendations about how to ameliorate those certain problems that a specific scientific community might revolve around. But, you know, there is a big question about how far epistemic authority can go and whether international organization or governments want to keep science on tap, you know, under control, turn on the tap, turn off the tap, or whether science can get on top of formal decision makers and have this guiding or determining power over policy. I think that's a very big unresolved social science question about the power of knowledge in policy making. When it comes to transnational knowledge regimes, and I'll end on this particular slide, there are lots of big questions that I think will be perennial questions about the role of expert authority in the making of global and regional policy, the extent to which transnational networks of the type that I've been describing, just how influential they are becoming, their impact and influence as nodes or centers of epistemic decision making, given that there is relatively low understanding of their extensiveness amongst everyday publics. Just how much, what is the extent of their power in transnational arenas, given that we don't have global government and that the institutions of global governance that we do have are relatively weak. So are these particular policy networks operating without a great deal of oversight, in the sense of lack of transparency, lack of accountability, lack of effective ways to evaluate their performance? And then finally, there is this issue of exclusivity of knowledge networks, but also other policy networks, in the sense of what kind of groups can get into, let's just focus on knowledge networks. What kind of credentials do you need to have? What kind of training? What kind of recognition from your peers in order to be able to participate in knowledge networks, but also policy networks, which can be quite exclusive domains and restrictive for wider societal engagement. So I don't want to end on a bleak note, but I think there are some very important issues about making transnational policy networks much more transparent, accountable, and accessible. And on that note, I shall end.
Great. Thank you so much, Diane. There's lots of issues and interesting questions, which I'm sure will come up. So colleagues in the audience, please, you can type your questions in at any time into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screens, and then we'll be able to curate them a little bit later on, so speakers can address them. So thanks, Diane, and over to you, Flavia.
Thank you, Inderjeet. Thank you very much, Inderjeet and Juvaria, for hosting this global conversation series and for inviting me. My presentation is on the OECD enlargement in Latin America. It's part of an attempt to address some issues of contemporary global economic governance, focusing on the role I understand the OECD plays as a very important and peculiar multilateral organization, particularly in the accession processes of its prospective members. So fundamentally, what I argue is that the OECD is now, maybe more than ever before, an expanding Western-led institution aimed at promoting a very liberal economic agenda through enhanced global governance mechanisms. And I think looking at the the enlargement process and the accession processes in themselves is an important issue to raise attention to these several dimensions I would like to bring here. So what I will present is not a very organized presentation, but a number of comments suggesting that looking at the OECD is important to understand several dimensions of contemporary international relations, such as hegemonic reordering attempts since the end of the Cold War, for instance, as a first dimension. Looking at the OECD is also important for me in order to reflect on multilateralism, and particularly on the future of multilateralism based on selective clubs like the OECD instead of universal multilateralism we used to have in the economic field, such as the WTO negotiating process with the whole number of its members. And the OECD is also very important, I think, in order to understand specific mechanisms of internalization of global governance policies and ideas, such as the way the accession to the OECD is intended to promote what it's called the lock-in of domestic government might not be able to be constitutionally embodied in domestic law. Or also, I would point the way the OECD promotes transnational elites consensus building and the mobilization of domestic groups in this process. Or finally, the way in which the accession process for Latin American prospective members has tried in recent years to follow electoral calendars as a way to support market-oriented right-wing governments in the context of presidential elections. It really took place from the role the Secretary General has played in these accession processes to have linkages between electoral calendars and the way the process was conducted. And so to start with, the OECD plays these multiple roles as a selective club, as a standard setting organization, as a think tank, which produces a huge amount of knowledge in almost all areas of public policies, and which has been very successful in promoting the diffusion of its recommendations. I would like to quote here the French President, Emmanuel Macron, on the OECD. Last December, at the commemoration of the 60th anniversary of the OECD, President Macron said, I quote, in a context in which multilateralism is criticized for its inability to respond to major contemporary challenges, there is a striking counterexample, and that is the OECD, which continues to run and to produce results. So I find it, this declaration particularly meaningful in the way it is an assessment of the efficiency of an international organization that is quite uncommon in recent times regarding other international organizations. So now looking first at the OECD's enlargement in the last decades, very briefly, at the end of the Cold War, the OECD had 24 members. And during the 1990s, it has admitted 6 new members, Mexico and Korea, together with 4 Eastern European countries, which were the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, and the Slovak Republic. In the case of Mexico, it is worth remembering that the accession to the OECD took place simultaneously to the implementation of NAFTA, expressing then the symbolic and practical dimension of Mexico's new relations with North America and developed countries, as well as its commitment to economic liberalization and market reforms. Also important, both Mexico and Korea, when acceding to the OECD, were formally required to cease to be members of the G77, the coalition of developing countries in which they were founding members, then reflecting the view that belonging to these groupings, the OECD on one side and the G77 on the other side, was a fundamentally exclusive strategy. So they had to choose it, and they chose the OECD. After that, in the 90s, the following phase in the enlargement of the enlargement process of the OECD was launched in 2007 and to 2010, with the accession of Israel, Chile, Slovenia, and Estonia, establishing then a pattern in which the acceptance of each new European member involves the simultaneous acceptance of a country from a different region in order to avoid an excessive weight for Europe in the organization. So after that, since the years 2010, the most recent countries to join the OECD as full members were Latvia, Lithuania, and finally Colombia last year. And at the moment, the only country to be at present in the category of candidate for accession is Costa Rica. Last year, shortly after the announcement that Colombia became the 37th member of the organization, Costa Rica received the Council's invitation and is set to become the 38th member as soon as it deposits its instrument of accession to the OECD convention, so only pending domestic ratification. Therefore, what I want to stress, since the end of the Cold War, with the exception of Korea and Israel, all the new full members to the OECD are European and Latin American countries, indicating the geographical dimension of this Western Alliance expansion to its zones of influence, and also the crucial role the US and major European countries play in these accession processes. It is important to mention that previously to this very Latin American strategy, there was also a previous alternative strategy of enlargement in the year 2000. In 2007, the OECD had initiated Russia's accession process, which in fact never made any progress and was indefinitely suspended in 2014 as a reaction to the invasion of Crimea. But also in 2007, the OECD had launched a strategy for increasing contacts with its contacts with 5 selected non-member countries, which were Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, and South Africa. So it was the BRICS group before it was institutionalized, plus Indonesia. So this initiative can be understood at that time as an attempt to promote flexible patterns of relations with some of the rising powers of the first decade of the 21st century, Indonesia and the BRICS countries, even before they organized themselves as a formal mechanism, in the context at that time of still very optimistic expectations regarding the possibilities of absorbing emerging countries in some expanded version of liberal Greater West. That I think it's important to understand this movement in the year 2000. The program was redimensioned in 2012, granting these countries the status of key partners and establishing a halfway category between full membership and disengagement, as well as several mechanisms for closer relations and possible channels of influence between these countries and the OECD. The results of this strategy were highly heterogeneous, with Brazil and South Africa showing much greater receptivity to this closer relations with the OECD. China and India revealed a much more restricted response, and the weaker situation of Indonesia in terms of its engagement in the process of convergence of its domestic practices with the legal framework of the OECD. Since then, since 2012, the participation of non-members in OECD activities has been particularly valued by the organization, so that a non-member country can participate in full terms in the activities of the committees and subsidiary bodies of the organization, and even take part in the decision-making process of the body in which it has been accepted, with almost all the same rights and obligations of the member countries, including the commitment to implement its decision. So the only difference in relation to full member countries consists in not taking part in activities related to the accession processes of new members in the organization. Then, in addition to the importance the OECD has conferred to the participation of its key partners in committees and subsidiary bodies, and especially as associate members, the OECD also tried to institutionalize specific cooperation agreements with each country. With Indonesia in 2012, a limited memorandum of agreement with China in 2014, and the cooperation agreement with Brazil, which was signed in 2015 and was then considered the most ambitious one for envisaging a higher number of possibilities of convergence to OECD legal instruments, as well as the acceptance of peer review of public policies. So since then, Brazil was the only country among the key partners to have formally presented its candidacy for a full membership. Indonesia and the other 4 members of the BRICS grouping have not expressed any interest in full membership. And therefore, Brazil has remained as the only BRICS country who is seeking to be part of the OECD in the context of an enlargement strategy, which has been exclusively regional in Latin America and in Europe up to now. So in recent years, the OECD Council was formally assessing the candidacies of 6 prospective members, which were in South America, Brazil, Argentina, and Peru, and in Europe, Romania, Croatia, and Bulgaria. There has been no consideration at all regarding the accession of countries from other regions. So I think it is relevant to highlight regarding Latin America the role it plays as a region for the expansion of the Western Alliance, for individual countries' relations with the US, for the promotion of convergence with OECD practices, simultaneously to a context in which the growing importance of China in the region as a trade and investment partner in Latin America should be considered as a part of the determinants for the OECD's interest in the region in expanding in Latin America. There are economic purposes at stake, but also clearly a geopolitical dimension for understanding the OECD enlargement in Latin America. It's worth mentioning here that the OECD is currently in the final process to select its next Secretary General to succeed the Mexican Angel Gurria, who will be, whose term is ending in June. So there shall be a new Secretary General appointed now before the end of March to a 5-year mandate beginning in June. There are now 2 candidates, a Sweden candidate and an Australian candidate. And the Australian candidate is known as a supporter of tougher relations with China and may consider new strategy, and it said that he may consider new strategies for the OECD regarding Asia Pacific as a region. So it might be the new Secretary General, which in the OECD plays a crucial individual role, might be the opportunity for new regional strategies and enlargement processes in the near future. So now moving briefly to domestic dimensions, I want to mention how the OECD is such a prestigious club that countries are willing to take on highly costly, very high, costly and difficult reforms in order to become full members. It is absolutely unanimous among officials from all the countries that have concluded their accession to a full membership that this is an extremely difficult negotiating process that involves very high costs at the entrance. All the costs are concentrated mainly in the accession process. And it really reproduces north-south pressure, which in the past took place in other fora, such as the GATT negotiations, the north-south dimensions, which were evident in the Uruguay round for the acceptance of the so-called new issues, intellectual property rights, investments, and trade in services, where Brazil and India were the last big developing countries to try to resist to the developed countries' agenda at the end of the 80s and concluded in the beginning of the 90s and leading to the creation of the WTO. So I'm mentioning this very clear North-South agenda. In the case of Colombia, it's been said that what has been imposed to Colombia in terms of intellectual property rights goes much further. It's WTO plus. It's much more than than is already applied in the OECD members themselves. So this is the way I think we can broadly consider this process of enlargement and selecting new members in a multilateral fora, which maybe imposition takes place in a different manner. Maybe it's not the most accurate idea, because together with that, my last point is to stress the very particular mechanisms of internalization that the OECD implements. It has a lot to do with the think tanks and the global networks Diane just presented. And I I have followed the Brazilian experience in recent years and the crucial role the OECD Business Network and the OECD Global Parliamentary Network have played in mobilizing domestic groups in building domestic coalitions to support the OECD agenda. This, of course, has intensified since 2016 after the impeachment of President Dilma, after the end of the Workers' Party's government, and it became a high priority for the Temer administration and for Bolsonaro's administration in the context of a foreign policy very much aligned to the US and to developing closer relationships with developed countries. So to conclude, I would say that from the Brazilian perspective, the public debate on the implications of this, the country's candidacy to full membership have been limited up to now and have been dominated by very enthusiastic views and interests on the matter. For the moment, considering the complexity of the adjustments required to the internalization of the normative framework of the OECD, as well as the high costs involved in the negotiations of the accession process, what I expect is that the mobilization of broader domestic support could broader debates foster broader debates on the matter, because for the moment, the idea for most people in Brazil is mainly that getting to the OECD is a symbolic status for diplomatic purposes, and no idea at all of the costs involved and the convergence of practices, norms, and economic regulation. So as Brazil has become the most active non-member of the OECD in terms of its participation in committees, legal instruments, in the organization, my understanding is that there could be a possibility in trying to innovate through an institutional strategy aiming to keep some kind of a la carte pattern of relationship instead of a strategy seeking for full membership. I understand that this is also rooted in these considerations must also be taken in regard to geopolitical trends at the moment. And instead of a full membership to one Western European alliance, the country should seek this innovative approach to the OECD in keeping its engagement in several committees and participating, which is the tradition of Brazilian diplomacy, to be very active in all multilateral fora, to participate, but the full membership, I understand, is not what a country like Brazil should seek in any kind of government for the short term. That's what I wanted to raise as maybe provocative ideas to share with you in the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Flavia. That was really interesting. A lot of questions suggest themselves and people have already started asking in the Q&A as well. Thank you very much. We'll move over now to our third speaker, Omar from UMass Amherst. Thank you, Omar.
Thank you very much, Inderjeet, Juvaria, Tanya, and all the organizers for inviting me. It's really great to be part of this very important series and to speak among such wonderful speakers as well. And hopefully my talk will complement Diane's and Flavia's. And let me share my screen, if I may, here. All right. Can you see the screen? Great. So I've titled my talk, The Uncertain Promise of South-South Relations, to discuss the fact of the matter of the rise of what we call South-South relations, and also to what extent do they can possibly be an alternative to the traditional North-South model of development. So I've written my talk, and I'm gonna hopefully stick to the time limit, but please feel free to cut me off. In 2012, a series of posters advertising the London-based HSBC Bank caught the eyes of international travelers in European, Asian, and North American airports. Hung on walls alongside moving walkways, the posters featured ironic or humorous photographs, each with a sentence above it starting with the words, "in the future." Created by the preeminent international advertising agency J. Walter Thompson, and designed to portray HSBC as forward-thinking, the marketing campaign highlighted different ways HSBC was at the cutting edge of banking and commerce worldwide. One poster in particular was really striking to me. The poster showed a paragraph of a gray Chinese terracotta warrior with a steely gaze. Everything about his image was similar to the classic photos of the terracotta warrior statues, except for one detail. Instead of boots, the warrior wore bright yellow and green flip-flops. Over the photo was the line, "In the future, South-South trade will be norm, not novelty." And 4 sentences below elaborated on the idea. Direct trade between fast-growing nations is reshaping the world economy. HSBC is one of the leading banks for trade settlement between China and Latin America. There's a new world emerging. Be part of it. This poster really provides an ideal entry for a critical examination of South-South relations and South-South trade in particular. The ideas conjured by the terracotta warrior photo and the poster in general are a perfect metaphor for the pervasiveness and the complexity of the economic activity that characterizes this whole vast subject. What I'd like to focus on, and what really struck me from this poster, are 3 aspects that I feel capture the complexity that I've come to sort of appreciate about South-South trade from studying it over the last 15 to 18 years. And I summarize it this way. The first is that South-South trade has become an undeniable factor in global political economy. We cannot have a full account of global political economy without seeing and examining and understanding and appreciating South-South relations. And there are many factors. The second is looking at the changes in how we think about South-South trade from the past, the way we used to think about it in the early post-war period, or the third worldist period, and today. And I call this not your grandma's third worldism, grandma reference to the Cuba. Anyway, that's my way of referencing it. Not your grandma's third worldism. This is not the third worldism of the old post-war non-aligned period. How can we look at the differences between this period and today? And finally, looking at the implications of South-South relations on what I call the new global division of labor, and is sort of exemplified by what this sort of the Chinese have the mighty warrior and the Latin Americans are selling the flip-flops, captures more than probably what HSBC meant even in this poster. So some of the main points that I'd like to go over in my time are the shifting battle lines over South-South trade. And here I mean South-South trade to capture a whole host of South-South relations. Sometimes as a byword, it's referred to South-South trade, but South-South relations in general. I'd like to give a sense of the rise of South-South trade and finance, some statistics about it, but also look at how really the global South has vastly split between what we can call the emerging South and the rest of the South. And the ways in which the emerging South is not just growing faster than the rest of the South, but at the expense perhaps of the rest of the South. And finally, looking at forms of presence of different forms of presence of South-South relations, such as in preferential trading agreements, the WTO, and the whole debate about China in this and that, Latin America, Africa, and so on. So the first sense. In much of the post-war period, until the 1980s, South-South economic relations were a flashpoint for debate between supporters and critics of universal free trade, state-led development, and import substitution industrialization, or ISI. The relatively scarce literature tended to focus overwhelmingly on the benefits or drawbacks of trade integration among developing countries. The supporters' rationale was the ostensible benefits for industrialization in the South. Prebisch, for example, had famously advocated for the enlargement of national markets through the gradual establishment of a common market in Latin America to take advantage of specialization and economies of scale. Gunnar Myrdal supported South-South integration to help the global South overcome the colonial legacies that bias their trade in the form of North-South trade. And Linder had argued that similarities in consumer preferences, resource-based and technological development, as well as institutions, are likely to make South-South integration more beneficial to Southern industrialization than North-South trade. The critics at that time, here I'm talking about 60s to the 80s, the more mainstream economists, basically argued, and their attitude was summarized by a famous article by Havrelachen and Wolf, that, quote, if a developing country does a great deal of trade with other developing countries, this is probably a sign that it has distorted domestic prices. So South-South trade, according to the critics, was an attempt to recoup the losses from ISI. So given their inability to penetrate northern markets due to the high cost and low quality of their consumer goods, a large industrializer like Brazil, for example, would offload low quality capital intensive products to neighboring Paraguay thanks to preferential treatment in LAFTA, for example. However, even this opinion was debated. Alice Amsden, for example, showed that much of South-South trade in capital goods was intra-industry trade and intermediate products, most of which was not subject to preferential treatment. So there was a debate back and forth about the benefits of this. Research, however, on South-South trade during that period remained minimal. And there was a very basic reason for that, was because South-South trade itself remained minimal. It was very little as a percentage of global trade. What we saw in the 1990s until today, as I'll elaborate on in a second, is a takeoff of South-South trade. And here we've seen a sort of shift somewhat in the battle lines. People or critics, heterodox economists that used to be on the side of advocating South-South trade are much more likely to now sort of promote it or sort of be critical of it, and basically draw caution about the uneven qualities of South-South trade, about how it's basically recreating North-South uneven development, how it's creating new forms of dependency. Whereas we've seen much more enthusiasm coming from, the so-called mainstream. We've seen the World Trade Organization, we've seen, the Wall Street Journal, all sources that you would not expect to be sources that are enthusiastic about, this old, what we call the old third worldism, and even citing Prebisch, several times in these Wall Street Journal, WTO, something strange is happening in these battle lines. And in fact, even among heterodox economists, there's a debate about, is this beneficial or is it not beneficial? So we've seen some shifting battle lines, and I think, there's a reason for that, was because on the one hand, there's, from the global north, traditionally a demonization of South-South trade, perhaps, or seeing it as abnormal or unnatural, and therefore there's a wholesale rejection of it. But even among heterodox or critical or progressive economists, political economists, activists, and so on are cautious, because they're seeing some, not from the North perspective, but even from a developmental perspective, reasons to be cautious about this emerging trends. So what's the good news in this picture? Well, first is that there's a dramatic rise in South-South trade. For most of the post-World War II period, South-South trade remained marginal in world trade, fluctuating around 10%. However, there has been, particularly since the 1990s, a dramatic shift, reaching as much as 28% of world trade by 2013. The importance of Southern South-South exports in total Southern exports has also increased substantially, reaching from around 20% in the 1950s to 60% in 2013. So we've seen dramatic changes in both South-South trade as a percentage of global trade, but also as a percentage of South exports to the world. They're more likely to export now to other developing countries. And this sort of captures this general increase. So we see here the straight black line is the rise of South-South trade from 1948 until 2012. We've seen a steady increase, and most significantly after the post-1990 period, we've seen dramatic increases as well there. So that's the general positive side. And another aspect of this is that the structure of trade, we used to, or the old sort of debates used to basically insist that what you export matters. Are you exporting very low intensive primary products, primary manufacturers, or are you exporting high skill products? And we've seen that there's a dramatic rise in high skill intensity, sophisticated capital goods in South-South trade. However, if we look at who among the global South is actually exporting, and here we've split the the world into three categories just for simplicity: the global North as the traditional OECD, not the new OECD, as Flavia mentioned, and what we are calling the emerging South, which includes about 30 to 40 countries, which admittedly have a significant chunk of the global population, and the rest of the South, which is around 140 to 150 countries, which have roughly less of a population as the emerging South, but constitute vast numbers of countries in Africa, the Middle East, and elsewhere. If we look at actually what's happening, we see that all of the growth in this global South trade is being captured in the emerging South. So that the rise of the South is in fact a bifurcation of the global South into two distinct groups: the emerging South and the rest of the South. And one of the impacts of the rise of the emerging South is deindustrialization and primarization of exports in many developing countries, including many emerging powers in the South. Even in the emerging South, which I don't have the data for it here, but even in that group that is supposedly the winners of this process, they're losing from trade among each other. So this reconfiguration of South-South trade has exacerbated the division of labor within the global South. So if we look at actually going back to a little bit past this time period, because data for all of those countries doesn't go back to 1948, if we look at what we look at as the rest of the South, we see a decline in terms of world manufacturers' exports, whereas the emerging South, which is the small dotted line, is increasing. The North exports of manufacturers are declining, but it's really being captured by a small subset of these countries. Here we see the same thing. We see the emerging South is capturing, if we talk about where is manufacturing going of high-skilled products, is going to a small subset of countries in the global South. And we see that, in fact, the rest of the South used to be more competitive 30, 40 years ago in terms of manufacturers trade than they are now. Perhaps not at a global scale, but even at a regional scale, there's this decline. So, for example, if we look at hone in on some of these statistics, you see that in terms of the emerging South, they're capturing 56, 35, and 55% of the share of Southern exports in low, medium, and high-skill manufactured goods, whereas 154 countries have almost negligible amounts of trade in these sophisticated products, right? So these 53 countries, and even within those 53 countries, actually, if we dig deeper, it's a smaller subset. So 74% of the rest of the South's exports were in primary commodities in 2012. And here there's an article by Jaime Ross, a Mexican economist who passed recently. He called it Prebisch's nightmare, which is this idea that these developing countries during the commodity boom have, in fact, the terms of trade turned in favor of commodities because of China's rise, which further entrenched them as commodity exporters rather than help them move up the development ladder. The top export item for the rest of the South was petroleum oils, which accounted for 58% of all of their exports. So we're seeing a primarization. Compared to 1970, there's more primary commodities being exported by those countries. If we look at some, for example, Latin American countries, and look at the period between 1990, this is Chile exports to China. The share of copper in total Chilean exports from 1990 to 2012 went up from 41% to 55%. And the share of copper exports in total Chilean exports to China went from 21% to 77%. Most of this exports to China that Chile sends is in primary product, which is copper. And of course, China makes up a bigger bulk of their exports there as well. So we're seeing this process of solidifying this primarization. This, again, just one last example, when China was admitted in the WTO in 2002 to 2003 period, before China was admitted, Latin America used to export. So this square that I have here looks at the imports of China from Latin America of manufactured products that we've classified as low, medium, and high skill products. The exports of Latin America to China all significantly dropped by 2012, less than a decade after China was admitted into the WTO, whereas they were exporting significantly more manufacturers there. So that's about trade, and there's similar trends happening in financial flows. But there are other forms of presence to this, and it's more complicated, and I want to briefly run over some of these other forms of presence. And the first is preferential trading agreements. I'm going to talk briefly about South-South blocs and coalitions in the World Trade Organization, and then a few words about the China in debates. So asymmetries in bargaining power, knowledge, and negotiating capacity, and retaliatory capabilities are argued to bias bilateral trade and investment agreements, favoring the North over the South. So all these trade agreements, the North-South trade agreements, were really biased towards the North because of their unequal power dynamics. While these asymmetries are also arguably present in South-South direction, the gap is smaller, allowing more policy space to developing countries to experiment with economic policies that are most suitable to their needs. So if you look at, and I'm going to come back to this, an obvious effect or reflection of these asymmetries is that four northern countries, the US and the EU region, but the EU as a whole, Canada and Japan, were responsible for 52% of all trade-related disputes filed in the WTO. But what we see since the 1990s is a dramatic rise of South-South preferential trade agreements as reported to the WTO. And so this is around this time period here of 1990 to 1992. So even while these countries were liberalizing significantly, this is sort of, let's say, the neoliberal period, they were also forming coalitions and free trade agreements with other South members. And basically, while there are many motives for this, some of these were driven by the desire to become export platforms regionally. There was a lot of multinational corporations driving this. For example, in Mercosur, when it was signed as the common market, there was a push for using that region as an export platform for multinational corporations so that they don't have to incur costs when they, let's say, export between Brazil and Argentina or between other places in the global South. You saw this. Nevertheless, the rise in South-South preferential trading agreements does allow some of these countries more room to maneuver in terms of their policy space than with the traditional sort of North-South configurations. So there's something to be said about this rise in South-South PTAs. And if we look at some of these statistics, the average annual number of new preferential trading agreements between 1958 and 1988 was 30, and increased to 267 between 1989 and 2013, 75% of those agreements were South-South preferential trading agreements. So what's happening in the WTO? So the WTO is really interesting because, the legacy of that G77 that Flavia mentioned, and where you used to see more activity in the UN General Assembly for South-South coalitions, that has died down in the United Nations. But the one place I would say where the legacy of that third worldist push remains is the WTO. And China, for example, when it entered the WTO, despite having this negative impact from the perspective of the other emerging South, has generally supported South-South coalitions in the WTO. The main factor in the WTO really, and if we look at the WTO dispute mechanism as an indicator, we see that the WTO is essentially the low-income countries are not complainants or respondents on most disputes. Most of the disputes are happening, to use old language, between the core and the semi-periphery. There's an attack by the core countries, the Quad, the North, the EU, the US, Japan, and Canada. Most of the complaints are between the very rich countries and the rising South, the emerging South. And that is essentially showing this sort of global struggle over policy space between those two groups. The low-income countries are really very, don't factor here, but that's not necessarily a good thing. I mean, on one level, it's a good thing that there aren't a lot of complaints being leveled against the lowest income countries. But nevertheless, that also shows the downside of that is that they're not a factor in global trade, because trade disputes are not arising between them. So nevertheless, one of the biggest successes of the South-South coalitions in the WTO, which I sort of evoke the Polanyian double movement, is the fact that the theoretical one member, one vote aspect of the WTO has succeeded in bringing about a stalemate. And this was starting in, the legacy of the late Seattle protests, but even after the series of ministerials, bringing out a stalemate by slowing down the rate of the change pushed by the Quad, by disrupting major agreements on further liberalization in ways that really the Quad was heavily invested in. And that, I think, explains part of the reason why the EU and the US perhaps is going towards the OECD route. It's trying to peel off that solidarity among the global South. And nevertheless, one positive aspect, as I mentioned, of China's inclusion of the WTO is that it has generally not defected or broken rank from the general South-South sort of coalitions, the African Caribbean partnerships, G20, G33. There was a like-minded group. So you see some of that positive aspects happening there.
Omar,
Yes, I'll end. Can I end one more minute?
Two.
Okay, great. So finally, I'll be talking about the last form of presence and the last debates about China in. And here I'll focus on China and Africa, which, sort of surveying this vast literature on China and Africa. There's too much to be sort of said about what it says, but one way we can analyze it is thankfully a growing sophistication and appreciation of the complexity. So there was a first generation of this literature, which basically took China and Africa to be homogeneous actors, and their relationship and the interaction between them is either good or bad. The second generation recognized, thankfully, that Africa is not homogeneous, that it varies characteristics in terms of the size of the country, its natural resource base, the bargaining power, its governance structures, and so on. But it kept China as a homogeneous actor. And then the third generation that we're moving towards is recognizing that neither China or Africa or other countries, of course, not just Africa, are homogeneous actors. China, there's different forms of presence in terms of laborers, in terms of federal state-owned enterprises, provincial state-owned enterprises, private capital, small firms, and so on. And these have very different effects depending on their presence. So some concluding thoughts, and that's my last minute. There's a lot at stake in South-South relations. There's a lot of ways in which provides potential for development and growth and manufacturing in sort of industrial development. But it's complicated. It's, there's vast regions that are being left out, and simplistic analysis that either sees it as a panacea or dismisses it as abnormal is really not helpful. Certainly market solutions alone are not the solution. Market forces are not the solution. So you can't just leave South-South trade just to its own magical way that it's going to solve the problems of development in the South. But there's a bigger problem at stake here, which is who speaks on behalf of the rest of the South. In the past, when we had these South-South coalitions and the non-alignment movement, there was sort of a collective voice. Now, especially as more and more large countries are being peeled off to go to the OECD or to go to the sort of big rich country club, who's speaking on behalf of the rest of the South? Perhaps it's issue networks or interest networks, perhaps it's something else, and that's something to discuss. And sorry for taking more than my share of time.
Oh, that was really interesting, and I'm sorry to have to rush you towards the end there, but very interesting. Loads of questions have already come up on the Q&A, so I think I'll just kind of move to that and ask colleagues, speakers to address pretty much to some extent in the order in which they've been asked. And Diane, you're up first. There's a couple of questions which you're asked in the chat in terms of the inclusivity or representation issues that you observe in global knowledge networks, and also how does that apply in a way to the way in which the COVID-19 vaccines, the politics of distribution, and we know that the World Health Organization, the big power blocks voted to veto the IP waivers so that the poorer countries could actually produce their own versions of COVID-19 as well. So do you see in what you described, the big patterns and networks, the density of them, issues about inclusivity and representation, and does that lack of inclusivity perhaps lead to what we've seen in terms of the vaccine nationalism? You're muted, Diane.
Sorry, no matter how many times you do use Zoom, you still forget to turn off the mute. I think there are two separate issues there. There's the general question about representation and inclusivity. And it's a bit like belonging to a club, really. There are certain codes and practices in play within networks, even though they might be relatively informal. They're not I'll go back rather. There are certain social practices that are often involved in keeping certain people out and making it easier for certain others to be involved in networks. And it very much depends on the network in which that you're talking about. So a transgovernmental network, by very definition, is exclusive. Okay. It's exclusive because an everyday member of the public cannot join it. You can only be a participant in a transgovernmental network if you are an officer of the state and have certain recognized knowledge and professional experience in the specific area that is being dealt with. So let me mention an example, FATFA, which is the Financial Action Task Force, which spreads across many different countries. It became very important as a network after 9/11 because it's concerned with money laundering and the so-called movement of terrorist financing. So, this is a very specialized technical area of government cooperation, which involves many matters of high confidentiality and access to data. So for a whole variety of reasons, this is the kind of network that not anybody can join. Only the relevant kinds of officials can be participants in that particular kind of network. By contrast, a transnational advocacy network is much more porous. It's much more open or osmotic in the sense that if you're truly passionate about a cause that a particular advocacy network is proclaiming, then yes, you could become involved in that particular kind of network. Okay, but you still need to have the resources to do so. What I would say about transnational networks, whether they're at a regional level or even a more global spanning level, is that these are not cost-free enterprises in terms of participation. It takes a lot of time, and if you don't have institutional resources to support your time commitment to participation in a network, then you have to rely upon personal resources, and it's beyond the means of the vast proportion of people in the world to become involved in global or transnational networks, simply because they're much more removed from not just local physical areas of activity, but you need the hardware, you need to commit, as I say, significant resources to be involved in networks. In the case of knowledge networks, exclusivity is different. It works on different kinds of principles, in the sense that you need to be recognized by your discipline or by your profession, or by the relevant institutional players within a network as a credible actor who has something to offer, whether you're wanting to join as an individual or as a group or organization. So if you're trying to become involved in a knowledge network as an individual, then you need to have the right kind of training. Now, often that means PhD education or years of experience in a particular field, so that you have mastery of the scientific language, the communication codes. You can contribute to the scientific journals, the actual debate that is often very specialized and quite technical within a specific field. So this is an exclusivity that is of education and training and being able to operate on the same high expert level as others that are involved in that particular network, in the case of a knowledge network. So the forces or dynamics of exclusivity differ according to the type of network, but also the kind of resources, status, prestige that you as an individual or as an organization can bring as a stakeholder within a network. So that would be the more general response. Now, the question about epistemic communities and vaccines, I tried to address that in writing a little bit. The idea of, I think epistemic communities, if you want to think about health professionals, public health professionals making arguments about why it's necessary to have vaccine equity, to have the rollout of the vaccine more generally, whether you want to call them an epistemic community or just a more generalized community of experts, whether they were, just reading the question, sorry, a decisive force in the global coordination to distribute vaccine. I think they're just one player. I think there needed to be a huge amount of political capital behind that from key international organizations, as well as bodies like COVAX and Gavi. So a combination of the scientific evidence in combination with political willingness from key international institutions to do that. So I don't think it's just the case of epistemic power here. I think there needed to be huge political patronage from some key international institutions and actors in order to make that viable.
It's interesting though, Diane, that in regard to the networks that you discussed and the kind of barriers to entry, in a way, those are kind of structural advantages and structural disadvantages, which are then replicated from the world into those sorts of institutions.
Yeah.
So the voice and representation, it may not be nobody else is allowed in, but when you have barriers to entry, which are pretty steep for countries which have got lower resources and so on. So there is a kind of democratic deficit by virtue of that kind of barrier in itself.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the next question. For Flavia, you got a couple of questions about Donald Trump's promise to support Brazil's entrance to the WTO, and that having not come to fruition. And where how do you kind of account for that?
From what I understand from the question, it relates to the bargaining which took place when Bolsonaro, in an official visit to Washington, asked for Trump's support to its accession process to the OECD. And the bargaining process that took place is that Trump demanded that Brazil unilaterally waived its historical resource to special and differentiated treatment, which was a third worldist victory since the UNCTAD negotiations in the 60s and 70s. And in fact, the US has, during the Trump administration, promoted a kind of a competition between South American countries, which one would do its homework in terms of economic reforms and alignment to US positions in order to be given the priority in the queue to the OECD, I'm sorry. So Trump even extracted this kind of unilateral concessions, linking WTO positions and demands to the accession process to the OECD.
You have another question, Flavia, which is to do with Colombia being a member of OECD, but Brazil not. Well, how do you account for that?
Well, first of all, in economic in economic terms of domestic market convergence to economic reforms, Chile was first the most easy country to be integrated to the OECD. In 3 years, the accession process was concluded because the Chilean economy was already a very liberal, open economy and very close to what the OECD demands. Colombia has also moved much further and faster in that sense than you can think related to the Brazilian economy. But in the case of Colombia, you also have to take into account foreign policy ties and the military relationship between the US and Colombia. This is a very special relationship that entitled Colombia to move faster in its relation to the OECD. Brazil is a different case. Brazil, Argentina, where developmentalism and the role of the state in the economy is rooted in historical traditions. And even though it has changed a lot since the 90s, these are not easy countries, easy domestic situations in order to fully converge to developed countries' practices. Mainly regarding capital flows. That's what the OECD demands. If you have to mention the single condition, it is the opening of capital flows in converging to developed countries' practices.
Thank you, Javier. Omar, there's two or three questions which have kind of queued up for you. The first one is the kind of traditional one, that China manipulates its currency and so on. So do you think China does compete unfairly in global markets? What's your view of that question first?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. It's come up lots of times over the last 20 years. I mean, first of all, I don't think it competes unfairly. It competes within rules that have generally been set up by the West, in terms of, especially with the WTO. There's a lot to say about that. I mean, that's sort of the basic response, in the sense that, you know, China itself did not follow a neoliberal path, but could not have risen in the way that it did without the neoliberal transformation in the global economy, I think, particularly with the WTO. In regarding to currency manipulation, I mean, that's a constant accusation by the US, but it's not unfounded by long-term data. Basically, China abandoned its fixed exchange regime around early 2000s, I think 2005. And since then, it has appreciated against the dollar until for like the next decade. I think only in the last few years do you see the yuan basically depreciating vis-a-vis the dollar. In fact, for the first 10 years after the moving from a fixed exchange rate, it was actually the dollar that was losing value against the yuan. So that is really was unfounded. During the entire decade, you saw these accusations happening in sort of quite loud. I mean, more broadly, you know, the control of your currency is a sovereign right of a government. And so the question is, you know, what the government does with its currency is a question that has not been adjudicated properly and multilaterally. There is no currently a one multilateral forum where we actually deal with currency manipulation. Whether or not it's true in this case, I think it's exaggerated and not true for over a decade. But I think that's a broader question for whether or not that issue should be included under the WTO. I don't believe it should be considered a countervailing subsidy, which is what the US has argued over time. But maybe perhaps for the international trading system to function properly, you don't want countries engaging in this process, which may be harmful. And so there has to be a way of allowing countries to use it for developmental purposes, right? Which is what many countries have had and done during the ISI period, but in ways that are perhaps within certain limits, I would say. In terms of their environmental dumping and social dumping, I'm not quite sure what it means. Environmental, I mean, I think there's a lot of studies now looking at the environmental impact of, you know, this investment in hydroelectric mega dams that is quite devastating environmentally. There is increasing, however, evidence that in a lot of their deals, they are including environmental standards in ways that perhaps aren't monitored in the same way as with, let's say, what has the World Bank practices have become in terms of the monitoring of the actual impact assessment environmentally. But as, I mean, the group that has done a lot of work on this is led by Kevin Gallagher, who've examined all these agreements in detail. And one thing that Kevin Gallagher has said is that China has higher environmental standards abroad than it does in China, as opposed to sort of thinking about it in the traditional way where sort of Western companies go and lower standards abroad rather than the high standards they have at home. China, it's the opposite. It's higher standards abroad, which is not necessarily a good thing for what's happening inside China, but in a sense that it's not going out there and dumping environmentally. In fact, it's being held to higher standards, their companies. So that's sort of my main answer for that.
There's a really interesting question from Tom First, who asks, is China siding with the South at the WTO and other global governance organizations a symbol of Southern solidarity, or is it because China really hasn't really developed enough to be in the North, so it therefore doesn't side with North America or Europe? So is this a kind of geopolitical play at the moment because it's not able to compete effectively or be welcomed into the kind of northern circuits?
I mean, I think could be both. I mean, those are not necessarily mutually exclusive. I mean, I think everything you read about their pronouncements and their self-image and sort of the literature on this is that their self-image is still very much that they are a rising developing country. They're not a rich country. Now, we have to look at, as I said, the actual impact of their trade in some ways can replicate these old trading patterns. But nevertheless, for example, if you look at the way they've engaged in the WTO, the way they've engaged with Africa, which actually there were several African summits where they were willing to engage in a collective sort of dialogue that didn't translate into actual collective bargaining by African countries. But nevertheless, in those fora, at least, they approach it publicly from the sense that this is South-South solidarity. So they very much still consider themselves a Southern country. And I think given the geopolitical, and increasingly with Western and US sort of, this pivot to Asia, this attempt to isolate China or to sort of launch economic warfare, frankly, against China, this is likely to continue. I mean, why would they abandon those coalition? And they've been, to their credit in the WTO, standing up for the principles of special and differential treatment, trying to extend that principle as well. So I see those dynamics really occurring there in ways that are actually quite interesting and distinct from necessarily the impact of actual trade and financial policies.
Okay, we've only got about 3 minutes left, and I just want to ask a general question, perhaps for each of the speakers, and that is in terms of the kind of shape of world power and the kind of reconfigurations which are going on between North and South, within the South, and so on, and in the kind of domains that you each have looked at, do you see a kind of greater move towards what might be called democratization and greater levels of representation and sort of voice for previously relatively excluded or marginal states and economies? Is there a kind of broader democratization of the kind of networks, Diane, you've been talking about, and Flavia, as a result of the process that you've been referring to, and also for Omar, in the kind of South-South relations? Are we looking at a kind of more optimistic kind of future for the way in which world power is actually distributed and exercised?
Yes, it's always good to try and end on a positive note. I would say that there is been much greater and more extensive.
We've lost you, Diane.
Okay.
Okay, you're back.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. I was saying I think there is much more extensive South-South networking now. There are alternative ways of networking. There are subaltern networks. There's a very dense and diverse network ecology, if you like. That's not to say all networks are equally powerful, equally effective, equally open and inclusive. But there is opportunity for much greater South-South networking.
Okay, great. Thank you. Flavia?
Well, I'm not sure I'm very optimistic. On the one hand, there is, in fact, several new forums for all kinds of people and associations participating in the process. But at the same time, we have lost a universalism in international institutions. And I think this is quite worrying, that there could be a situation where future economic negotiations take place in selective organizations such as the OECD, and later are universalized without the participation of other countries. This is not new. It already happened since the Uruguay round negotiations. The OECD decides and then takes it to multilateral fora. But what we see at the moment is that the OECD, I think, is playing a greater role and might be an alternative fora for the paralysis of the WTO. And I don't know if it's my last speech, but I wanted to mention the fresh news that Diane has shared with us here, that the new Secretary General of the OECD has been appointed just now while we were here discussing, and it is the Australian candidate with the support of the US, and which was said to have the idea is that it will bring a bigger role, a more important role for regional dimensions in Asia Pacific and the OECD.
Okay, thank you, Flavia. Omar, I mean, you mentioned in your talk about the sort of bifurcation between the kind of the emerging South and then the rest of the South. But it seems to me that, you know, there is a kind of middle class global South, which has emerged and become very strong and aspirational and upwardly mobile, and leaving behind maybe a very large kind of underclass. But is that a new thing? I mean, I seem to remember reading in the mid 1970s of third world basket cases versus third world middle class states. Are we just not at the very, very kind of extreme end of a 40-year development of that kind of bifurcation, where some are kind of joining the club or are candidates for the club and others are kind of languishing somewhat? But overall, what it sounds like is that the liberal international order, which seems to be on its deathbed every 20 years, seems to be kind of nurturing by, you know, kind of bringing in new blood, new forces, new states, new economies as well, and new vigor.
Yes and no. I mean, yes, there's certainly it's a resilient beast, so to speak. But I mean, I mean, regions and regionalism is a structural factor of the global economy in ways I think that are not as easy to reverse as you know, perhaps as they were before. And yes, there are continuations from you know, over this 40-50 period. I mean, you know, China, inequalities within those countries as well. There's lots of, I mean, this bifurcation sort of for heuristic purposes was useful, but I mean, obviously the complexity there, even within and between those countries, is quite significant. And I think, you know, I mean, I think part of the thinking about part of this increasing multipolarity, and I didn't talk as much about the Middle East, even though there were a couple of questions about it, but you see really the rise of large developing countries who have tremendous wealth and tremendous power, projecting their power in ways that are quite destructive, right? And when we're moving from the era of US hegemony, it was almost a little bit like, be careful what you wish for, as many of us who are sort of you know, critical of the era of US hegemony and Western hegemony moved to multipolarity when there isn't a universal rules of the game, and which, you know, these quote unquote semi-peripheral powers have no restraint. You're likely to see more conflict. You're likely to see less, potentially, you know, less, you know, effective, equitable human development. And this is where, you know, this question of governance comes up, because the response is in global, international organizations, is creating more space for those most powerful countries. And that's what, you know, the reform of, you know, the voting rights in the World Bank. I think Robert Wade has shown that Africa's voting rights declined as China's improved. So, you know, how do we think now actually about global governance in this era of multipolarity? I'm not as optimistic. I'm actually on the more pessimistic sides, but we need to keep asking these questions.
Yeah. Thank you very much, all three of you, Diane, Flavia, and Omar. Really interesting interventions and a lot more questions. I usually try to hog most of the time for Q&A, but I was unable to, just because I thought I should allow the audience to ask as well. But thank you so much for your interventions and your Q&A handling and so on, and for making the time to join us. Next week, we will be talking about race as a factor in understanding sorry, what is it? Race and racism in understandings of world order. We've got three great speakers lined up for that as well. We'll be publicizing it further, but I want to thank the speakers. Thank you very much, Juvaria and Tanya, for all the work that you've done to make this happen this week. And of course, thank you for everyone who's joined us from all over the world for this very interesting discussion. We will see you again next week at 4 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, which we're still living in. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. See you, Flavia.